Many thanks for your attendance. And we have a very special speaker, someone whom I know quite well, because I was a former TA student with him. And he wrote, in my opinion, one of the best articles about Lovecraft as a person, which is also the title of tonight's talk. And I really think that understanding more about Lovecraft helps us to understand both um, our own fears, our own directives. And I think when you think of a horror writer who really had tremendous broad social appeal and serious cultural impact, you could do much worse than thinking about Lovecraft. Dr. Timothy Evans is a retired professor of folklore, folk studies at the Western Kentucky University, and he is the former. So he's from the American West, and you're from Colorado originally.
More or less.
Yeah, more or less Colorado. So with that very short introduction, because we've been a little bit late, apologies.
Thank you, Del, and thank you everyone for coming or for listening at home, as the case may be. I think this is perhaps unofficially a Halloween presentation for the Swedenborg Library, so happy Halloween, everyone. My presentation is partly a general introduction to Lovecraft for those of you who may not already know very much about him. I will talk a bit about my own research, a bit about his current status or reputation, some interesting issues raised by Lovecraft and by his work, and then questions, discussions, anything you want to talk about. I won't repeat my title, you can all read it there. A word about the images. I'm trying in my PowerPoint to use illustrations that were done earlier in the history of Lovecraft's work, mostly illustrations from his lifetime. So some of these people are artists who he personally knew and or who illustrated his work in their original publications, mostly in pulp magazines like Weird Tales. So these two, the one on the left is for his story, The Shadow over Innsmouth. That's presumably the narrator in the foreground looking east over the town of Innsmouth out towards the ocean. And on the right is an illustration for his story, The Color Out of Space, near the climax where the whatever it is that's come from space with a meteorite crashed on this farm in a remote area of Massachusetts and then is living in the well, is trying to come out again and go back out into space. And that's that illustration. And there we go. So Lovecraft, there's his dates. He lived to be 46. Arguably the most influential English language horror writer of the 20th century, as Poe was arguably of the 19th. Although cases can be made for some other writers. I've listed 3 of them there, and there may be some others you can make that case for. Lovecraft's goal, however, was to reinvent the horror story for the 20th century, leaving behind the themes of 19th century horror stories, ghosts, vampires, haunted mansions, all those Gothic trappings, and focusing instead on modern fears, or at least 20th century fears and anxieties. A word in the term horror story or horror writer, Lovecraft did consider himself to be a writer of horror stories, but he actually came during his life to prefer the term weird tales for what he did, rather than horror stories, which has slightly different connotations. The weird, the mysterious, the uncanny, stories which question the reader's sense of what is real. And Lovecraft, more specifically, is often credited with inventing a genre, or maybe you could call it a subgenre of the horror story, called cosmic horror. That is, horror deriving from the meaninglessness of human life and of human institutions, such as, for example, religion, when viewed on a cosmic scale. Lovecraft was a lifelong atheist. He decided when he was quite young his family were Baptists, but he decided when he was quite young that he was an atheist and thought, or at least came to think, that the cosmos is indifferent to human life and human ideals, and that humans can never really understand the nature of the cosmos. The illustration there is for the cover of the pulp magazine Astounding Stories, science fiction magazine from 1936. Lovecraft got the cover in that one for his novel, serialized novel At the Mountains of Madness, and you see there his human protagonist confronted with an alien being, a Shoggoth, actually, with which they cannot communicate. It is too alien. So a good summary, I guess, of Lovecraft's cosmic horror is the relatively famous opening of his story, The Call of Cthulhu. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. So the protagonists in Lovecraft stories tend to be scholarly men, characters quite similar to Lovecraft himself, scientists, folklorists, and as a folklorist myself, several of his central characters in his stories are folklorists. Anyway, academics of various kinds whose research reveals terrible secrets, which brings about maybe insanity or death, but at least transformation. And the idea, of course, that science can harm us was not something new to Lovecraft. It goes back at least to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But Lovecraft has put a kind of different spin on it with his idea of cosmic horror, not just that science will invent things like monsters, nuclear weapons, things like that, that will be harmful, but also that simply the revelations, the discoveries that science brings us will drive us mad. So in stories like The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow Out of Time, Lovecraft invented an alternate history of our planet in which humans are playthings of cosmic forces. So this history of the Earth in which these various creatures came from space in the early history of the planet, established cities on the Earth. Several different ones came. Sometimes they fought with each other. Life on Earth as we know it was created surely by accident from some of these early creatures that came here. And this Lovecraft mythos he creates. Another quote, this came from an essay from 1921 in which he was trying to justify his own kind of fiction, basically. Man's relations to man do not captivate my fancy. It is man's relation to the cosmos, to the unknown, which alone arouses in me the spark of creative imagination. This hits a time, the 20s to 30s, when Lovecraft was active as a writer, when modernism was becoming dominant, certainly in the literary establishment, literary academia, literary criticism in the United States. And in modernism, the subtleties of characters and the interaction of characters becomes a very central thing, more important maybe even than the plot. So Lovecraft is going in a really different direction from that, right? He's not focused, not that he doesn't have human characters, he does, of course, but not focusing so much on the subtleties of the interaction of human characters, but the human relationship to the universe, the human relationship to the cosmos. Sorry. Okay. Lovecraft, however, was also very much a regionalist writer. Most of his work is set in New England, but it's the New England of his imagination. He set many of his stories in imagined Massachusetts towns: Arkham, Innsmouth, Dunwich, Kingsport. He was influenced by the local color movement, which was a big thing in literature in his time and in the years kind of just before he came along. The local color writers who had various tricks they used, where regional setting was very important, and they would often, for example, use dialect as a way of kind of showing the regional association of characters in the story. So local color writers included people like Bret Harte, Joel Chandler Harris, Mary Austin, even Mark Twain. I mentioned here on my slide Sarah Orne Jewett and Mary Wilkins Freeman, because those are two who particularly influenced Lovecraft. They both wrote about New England. I just discovered this evening that Sarah Orne Jewett was a Swedenborgian. I had not even known that. Anyway, he used many of the techniques of local color writers, but his work is darker than most of them. Jewett and Freeman actually did both write ghost stories, but Lovecraft's work is definitely darker than theirs. That slide, by the way, is the north end of Boston. Lovecraft explored the north end of Boston, which was at that time one of the oldest parts of Boston in terms of the surviving architecture. Set one of his stories there at Pickman's Model. And then almost all of North Boston, the north end of Boston, got destroyed after that. Got knocked down and replaced by newer buildings, which really grieved Lovecraft. Anyway, here's Lovecraft's version of regionalism. From a relatively early story, the picture in the house. The true epicure and the terrible, to whom a new thrill of unutterable ghastliness is the chief end and justification of existence, esteems most of all the ancient lonely farmhouses of backwoods New England. For there the dark elements of strength, solitude, grotesqueness, and ignorance combine to perform the perfection of the hideous. The illustration there, which was an illustration for that story, is by Virgil Finlay, who was a pretty prominent illustrator in the magazines of the day and was a friend of Lovecraft. He illustrated a number of Lovecraft stories. So a little bit of biographical information here. Lovecraft, his initials were HPL, and he's often referred to by those. Lovecraft was self-educated, a rather eccentric person, a rather neurotic person, a very imaginative person. He had a number of neuroses which influenced his writing. For example, he had a phobia apparently of rats and mice, which came to play in stories he wrote, like The Rats on the Walls. He had a kind of fear apparently of the ocean, which was a little hard, I imagine, for someone who lived in a coastal town. But at any rate, that also comes to play in his stories. Perhaps most notoriously among his neuroses was his racism, which we'll get back to. But Lovecraft lived almost his entire life in Providence, Rhode Island. When he was a child, his family was wealthy and socially prominent, particularly on his mother's side. The Phillips were quite a socially prominent family. Lovecraft and his mother were proud of their Puritan New England roots. Lovecraft's father was British. He was also proud of that. He had a lot of sort of British affectations, like he used British spellings when he wrote, and then his American editors would have to change them to the American spellings. His father, Winfield, was a traveling salesman. When Lovecraft was 3 years old, his father was permanently hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital in Providence. Died when Lovecraft was 8. Lovecraft never saw him again after he was hospitalized when Lovecraft was 3. Lovecraft never knew that the cause was syphilis because you didn't talk about that kind of thing. So as far as he knew, it was hereditary insanity, which also becomes a theme in his fiction. Tainted heredity is a fairly major theme in Lovecraft's fiction. Lovecraft was close to his affluent grandfather, Whipple Phillips. When the father was institutionalized, Lovecraft and his mother moved into the grandfather's house, which is the lower image there to the right. Up on top, Lovecraft with his parents. I should perhaps mention that at that time, for certainly more affluent white families, at least in the US, for boys to have long hair and be dressed in basically dresses. That's another word for those I was trying to think of. But anyway, for boys to look like that was a common thing. I've seen people write about Lovecraft and say, "Oh, his parents were so weird they dressed him like a girl," but that would have been the normal way to do it at that time. Anyway, Whipple Phillips, the grandfather, had a big personal library. He liked to tell spooky stories, and Lovecraft read his books. So from that library, he read the Grimm brothers, he read Arabian Nights, he read a lot of classical mythology, he read Homer, he read other books by classical Greek and Roman writers, he read Poe. Lovecraft read when he was and wrote at a fairly sophisticated level when he was quite young. He was a bit of a prodigy. There also were a lot of scientific books in his grandfather's library, and Lovecraft particularly read the astronomy. He was very excited about astronomy, but other sciences, anthropology books, lots of things. But then the family goes through a kind of social descent. When Lovecraft was 14, his grandfather lost his money through bad land investments in Idaho, died shortly thereafter. So and Lovecraft's mother was basically too proud to work, maybe too unskilled to work, or both. But so the house was sold. They moved into a small apartment. They lived basically in poverty. They lived actually in an apartment in the house, which is you see on the slide. The upper photo is, of course, Lovecraft's mother, Susie, they called her. Her name was actually Sarah Susan, but she went by Susan and more specifically by Susie. Lovecraft's mother, it's probably fair to say that she got stranger and stranger over time. She convinced her son that he was an invalid and should stay home. Lovecraft apparently was a pretty good student in terms of his grades, but he did not, and when he was young, he wanted to be a professional astronomer. That was his goal. But he did not finish high school. Stayed home with his mother, who apparently told him that he shouldn't go out in the daytime because he would frighten people. So which was one reason probably that Lovecraft became something of a night owl. He would go on long nocturnal rambles around Providence. But he and his mother became essentially recluses when Lovecraft was in his late teens and on into his 20s. She also taught him her politics, old-time upper-class New England, racist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, anti-immigrant. Lovecraft became passionately attached to Providence, especially to its architecture, and came to know it very well. Later in his life, he would lead his friends on architectural tours around Providence. Would have been great to be in one of those. He read widely, became well-educated, albeit self-educated, in a number of fields. He was a regular visitor to the Ladd Observatory, which was the observatory of Brown University, just down the road from where he and his mother lived. He started going there when he was 12. Somewhere right around then, he somehow persuaded his mother to buy him a little telescope, but he would go to that observatory, talk to people there. They had a good astronomical library, apparently. He started to keep an astronomical journal. This is when he was 12. He also somehow got a printing press from somewhere, his own printing press, and started to print what he called the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy, which apparently he just passed around to his friends and family. But then when he was 16, he began to write an astronomy column for the local newspaper, which became nationally syndicated. He did that on and off for about 10 years. I'm sure people reading that didn't know it was written by a teenage boy. In his 20s, Lovecraft joined the amateur journalism movement, making a number of friends, albeit by correspondence. He had his own journal, which he printed himself and mailed out to his friends and associates in the movement. He began editing amateur journals and publishing in them, publishing poetry, essays, fiction. Most of his early poetry, honestly, is really wretched, but he wrote a lot of it. And some of his late poetry, and it was actually pretty good, but his early poetry, But anyway, essays, fiction. He became for several years the president of the United Amateur Press Association, which is one of two major amateur journalist organizations in the US. It still exists, although it a few years ago combined with another organization and changed its name. So it's not called that anymore. And he started to go to, he made a lot of friends sort of by correspondence through amateur journalism, but he also started to go to amateur journalism conventions, particularly up in Boston, and started to make some actual face-to-face friends at some of those. In fact, he met the woman who he married at those. So a poem by Lovecraft. This is the first part of a sonnet he wrote relatively later in his life, but he was a better poet by that time. I never can be tied to raw new things, for I first saw the light in an old town where from my window huddled roofs sloped down to a quaint harbor rich with visionings. Streets with carved doorways where the sunset beams flooded old fanlights and small window panes, and Georgian steeples topped with gilded vanes. These were the sights that shaped my childhood dreams. The church there is the First Baptist Church, where one of the oldest, most prominent churches in Providence, and it's where Lovecraft's family went when he was young and before he decided he was an atheist and not going to go to church. Since I mentioned it at the bottom, the Fungi from Yuggoth is a set of sonnets Lovecraft wrote. The title Fungi from Yuggoth might make you think they're all weird and horror and science fiction things, and many of them are. Some of them are these perfect little horror stories in a sonnet form. But many of them are more like this too. They're not all horror stories. Breaking out. Lovecraft's mother in 1919 was committed to the same psychiatric hospital as her husband. She died 2 years later. If you look at the literature, people don't seem to really know exactly what the issue was with Susie. She got stranger over time. She apparently also got so she couldn't really take care of herself over time. 1919, she briefly moved in with her sister, but then she got committed to the psychiatric hospital. She died actually from having gallbladder surgery and getting an infection at the hospital. But after his mother's death, Lovecraft really blossomed. Shortly after she died, he got married and he moved to Brooklyn, New York. He married Sonia Green, who was a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant. This would have absolutely horrified his mother. She was by profession a milliner. I assume the hat she's wearing in that photo of her is probably one that she made herself. They lived in Brooklyn. The marriage lasted 2 years. Although it's come out recently that they never actually got legally divorced. I don't know that Sonia realized that because she remarried later, which probably was illegal because she hadn't actually divorced Lovecraft. But Lovecraft quickly developed an extensive network of friends, including notables such as Harry Houdini and Hart Crane. There's a picture of Hart Crane there on the right. Lovecraft is estimated to have written 75 to 100,000 letters. So in a sense, just in terms of quantity, he's like one of the great letter writers. Some of them are over 100, some of them are quite short, but some of them are over 100 pages long. Something like 30 volumes of them have been published. I didn't hunt around and make a count before when I put together my PowerPoint, but that's about the number, maybe a little more than that. I've no doubt more will come out. When Lovecraft was in New York, he developed a pretty good circle of friends, a group that were called the Calum Club, who would get together and meet socially. But he also would go on long rambles around the city with his friends. And the poet, Hart Crane, who's best known for writing the poem Brooklyn Bridge, he and Lovecraft would go on rambles, nocturnal rambles after dark around New York and go look at the Brooklyn Bridge. Would have been interesting to hear those conversations. Lovecraft also became a professional writer after his mother's death. He began to publish professionally. Most of his fiction was published in pulp magazines, such as Weird Tales. Pulp magazines, you probably know, popular fiction magazines really proliferated in the 20s and 30s up to World War II or so. Tended to be very specialized, many of them. So science fiction magazines, mysteries, westerns, things like that. Some of them are really hyper specialized, like magazines that publish entirely stories about boxing or published humorous westerns or things like that. Weird Tales was the best known one for fantasy and horror, and probably still is one of the best known pulp magazines of that era, now looking back on it. The cover I put on my slide is fairly typical because it's amazing how many of the covers of Weird Tales from the 20s and 30s were racist. Beautifully young, usually scantily clad, white woman, menaced by some dark-skinned person, sometimes with a heroic white warrior coming to rescue her. That's a really typical Weird Tales cover. You can't necessarily assume it had anything to do with any of the stories in it, but it was just the typical cover. Um, but a lot of the stories in the pulp magazines of the era were fairly racist, and I'll get back to that. Much of Lovecraft's income also was from ghostwriting and editing. That is, fixing up the writing of other people or writing stories or poems or essays that were published under his clients' names. So maybe some writer who wanted to publish in the same kinds of magazines Lovecraft published in, but wasn't a good enough writer to have their stories accepted, would send their drafts, their outlines, their ideas, whatever it was to Lovecraft. And he might edit it a little, depending on how much work it needed, or he might completely write a new story based on the outline or whatever it was of his client. And they'd be published under the client's name. And there were quite a few stories published that were basically written by Lovecraft that were published under other people's names. But he also did other things like textbooks and things like that. His most famous client was Harry Houdini. Houdini had talked to Weird Tales magazine about publishing a story about his adventures in Egypt, where he goes under the pyramids and meets ancient Egyptian gods. But Houdini wasn't going to write the story, so Weird Tales contacts Lovecraft, and Lovecraft writes the story under the pyramids, which gets published in Weird Tales under Houdini's name. But that did set off a friendship between the two. They stayed in touch. Houdini would take Lovecraft out to dinner when he was in town. They were planning to write an expose of spiritualism, a book exposing spiritualism. And they started writing it, but then Houdini died, and it never got finished. Lovecraft also, after his mother's death, and especially after he left Brooklyn, traveled extensively on a remarkably small budget, because he didn't have much money at all, visiting historic and antiquarian sites up and down the East Coast, as far west as New Orleans. And I'll get back to that because that was the main focus of my research. When you say settling down, maybe sometimes you mean getting married, but in this case, I mean getting divorced. When his marriage ended in 1926, Lovecraft moved back to Providence. He moved in with his two aunts, Lillian and Annie, and he lived a life of writing, corresponding with members of what got to be called the Lovecraft Circle, his extensive network of correspondence, and traveling. And this is when he wrote the majority of his most famous stories. And you see it on the right there, up above the first pages of two of his better known stories, The Color Out of Space and The Call of Cthulhu, and two magazine covers at the bottom. The one on the left, the Weird Tales magazine, running The Shadow over Innsmouth, that's actually from 1948, which is 11 years after Lovecraft died. An interesting thing is that Lovecraft's later stories tended to be longer and tended to be better. I think without question, he in general improved as a writer as he went along. But as a consequence, his later stories tended to be rejected by the pulp magazines. They were too long or they were too literary. So pulp magazines often were hesitant to accept them. The Shadow over Innsmouth, which is unquestionably one of his best stories, was not accepted. He couldn't get any pulp magazine to publish it. It finally came out in a sort of chapbook that was printed by a fan of his, a friend of his. But Weird Tales didn't publish it until after he died. He started to get more and more popular. So magazines like Weird Tales wanted more things by him. So they started to publish some of these things that they had rejected earlier, like The Shadow over Innsmouth. Lovecraft was also a scholar. His essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, which came out around 1930-ish, is arguably the most influential essay ever published on this topic. It was a kind of survey of the horror story up to that point, but it also set forth a philosophy, an aesthetics of horror stories, which has been very influential in other writers of horror stories since then. Even those who don't necessarily like Lovecraft's fiction still often have been influenced by that. He died in 1937 at the age of 46 from stomach cancer. His posthumous reputation, during his lifetime, he had a small but passionate fan following. His reputation grew gradually after his death. Actually, two of his younger correspondents, the writers August Derleth and Donald Wandry, founded a company called Arkham House, specifically to publish Lovecraft, and they published a number of books of Lovecraft stories. If you can find those early Arkham House Lovecraft editions, they're worth fabulous amounts of money to collectors now. Arkham House actually became the leading small press in America publishing fantasy and horror through much of the 20th century, but it was founded to publish Lovecraft. And his reputation grows and his popularity grows pretty steadily from then on. Some prominent literary figures were advocates of Lovecraft. Jorge Luis Borges, for example, in the 60s published a survey of American literature, which prominently featured Lovecraft. In the US, for critics or academics to write about Lovecraft at all, I mean, didn't happen. But here, Borges, a really major international literary figure, publishes this survey in which he is regarded as a central character, as a central person in American literature. But others, Joyce Carol Oates, Fred Chappell, Michael Chabon, and many others have been advocates for Lovecraft. There also are others like Edmund Wilson who were dismissive of his work. He's always been controversial. Edmund Wilson in the 40s published a sort of little review essay about Lovecraft in which he called him a bad writer. But he also admitted that Lovecraft had a rather vivid imagination. More recently, editions have appeared in various series of classic literature, especially after his work entered the public domain in the early 21st century. Lots of editions began to appear of it. Anyway, just a few examples of those on my slide. With increased recognition of his work, there has also been increased scrutiny of a central problem with Lovecraft, namely his racism. Lovecraft's racism is most evident in his letters and some of his early fiction and poetry. And I could have put more direct examples of racist things that he wrote, particularly in some of his letters. There's one really awful early poem, which sometimes gets quoted, which I don't want to put those things on a slide because they're too awful, some of them. But I will say that in the course of his fiction, his racism gets transmuted. Fear of aliens in the sense of foreigners or immigrants becomes fear of extraterrestrials, different kind of alien. Fear of miscegenation, interracial marriage, etc., becomes human monster hybrids, like the Dunwich Horror, and the illustration there is from the Dunwich Horror. It's basically about miscegenation. It's about monsters born through the mating of a human with creatures from another, or a creature from another dimension. And it's a picture there. She's cuddling with her monstrous baby. Lovecraft did, to an extent, overcome some, not all, of the prejudices he was raised with during his lifetime. As I've already mentioned, he was raised to be anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic, and he married a Jewish immigrant. In his late stories, his aliens tended to become sympathetic. They kind of went through a progression from being threatening to being more kind of enigmatic, fascinating and enigmatic, to being sympathetic, some of his late stories. So here's a relatively early story, The Horror at Red Hook. This is one of the ones he wrote when he lived in Brooklyn. When he lived in Brooklyn, he enjoyed New York City in many ways, but he also expressed horror at its cultural and racial diversity, all the languages he heard, and people who seemed odd looking to him because they looked different than he did. And he wrote letters about how horrifying that was. And it worked its way into his fiction. The Horror at Red Hook is set in the Red Hook neighborhood in Brooklyn. The plot is about a detective who is investigating the disappearances of various white people. And the detective discovers they've been kidnapped by a cult, an underground cult, literally under the ground in Red Hook, who are sacrificing them. Enough said about the plot. But this is his description of Red Hook. Red Hook is a maze of squalor near the ancient waterfront. The population is a hopeless tangle and enigma, Syrian, Spanish, Italian, and Negro elements impinging on one another. It is a babel of sound and filth and sends out strange cries. Here once a brighter picture dwelt, with clear-eyed mariners, i.e. white people, and homes of taste and substance. From this tangle of material and spiritual putrescence, the blasphemies of 100 dialects assail the sky. Horror at hearing all these languages. Swarthy, sun-pitted faces disappear from windows. Pretty blatant racism there, the way he describes the Red Hook. And those things are, the diversity is terrifying. It's what makes the story frightening. But then, 1936, the year before his death, he publishes his novel, At the Mountains of Madness. The plot of At the Mountains of Madness is about a scientific expedition to Antarctica, which discovers the ruins of a very, very old city, which was a city of extraterrestrials who were there long before humans were around. They find the bodies of some of these extraterrestrials who are very, very different from humans, and thaw them out, and they wake up. I won't say more. They may remind you of The Thing, which actually was based on John W. Campbell's story, Who Goes There, which was very influenced by Lovecraft. But at any rate, here is his description of these aliens. He refers to them as old ones. Poor old ones, scientists to the last. What had they done that we would not have done in their place? God, what intelligence and persistence. What a facing of the incredible, radiance, vegetables, monstrosities, star spawn. Whatever they had been, they were men. So he's gone from dehumanizing people he regards as foreigners in New York City to humanizing extraterrestrials who are really different from humans. Okay, Lovecraft and me. The writer and critic Victoria Nelson describes one major component of Lovecraft fans, an adolescent male culture of boys who often grow up to be scholars. Pretty good description of me. I discovered Lovecraft when I was 13. My English teacher handed around catalogs for scholastic books in class, and there was a Lovecraft in there. I never heard of him, but I thought, oh, it looks interesting, and I ordered it. And it was the book on my slide. That was the book. I've long since lost my copy, but I found that image of the cover there on the internet. Picture of me at probably age 15, not 13, but. So I discovered him. I became quickly obsessed with him. I read everything by him that I could find. Fortunately, our public library had a lot of Lovecraft books. One thing I read was his extended essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature, which among other things is a survey of that genre up to the time he wrote it. And I tried to read everything mentioned in that essay. I couldn't find everything, but so not just more contemporary writers like M.R. James or Algernon Blackwood or people like that, but I was reading these long Gothic novels like Melmoth the Wanderer when I was 13. Because of Lovecraft. I had never really read horror stories before then, but my parents thought I was losing my mind. So life goes on. I became a folklorist, went to college, eventually got my PhD, did many other things. My doctoral dissertation was on the craft of Western saddle making in Wyoming, so really different from Lovecraft. My interest, I continued to enjoy Lovecraft, but my interest in him faded into the background of my life. 1996, S.T. Yoshi's definitive biography of Lovecraft is published. My father gave it to me as a Christmas present. My father wasn't a Lovecraft fan. He must have asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and I said that. I can't remember, but I read it, and it reignited my interest in Lovecraft. It wasn't just me. It set off a boom in Lovecraft scholarship, that new biography. In the 21st century, there has been a burgeoning of Lovecraft research. Also, many definitive editions of his work, publishing previously unpublished works, and more and more and more and more volumes of his letters. I somewhat randomly chose some books to put on the slide. Up on top is the later expanded, revised version of the biography by Yoshi, one of the volumes of his letters. Weird Realism, I'll get back to that book, but it's basically applying Lovecraft to philosophy, I guess you could say. The other three books on the slide are collections of scholarly articles on Lovecraft that have been published relatively recently. But there's been lots of publications on Lovecraft. In fact, I'm partway through one that just came out recently called Lovecraft and Astronomy. My research focused on Lovecraft's travels, his interest in architecture and the built environment, and folklore, and historic preservation, and how all of this played into his fiction. Lovecraft referred to himself as an antiquarian, a person who loves the material remnants of the past, a term that's rather out of fashion now, but wasn't in his day. So I spent several summers at Brown University in Providence, where his papers are housed in the John Hay Rare Books and Manuscripts Library there. The John Hay Library hosts the papers of a number of well-known people. Thoreau, I remember, is one. No, I'm forgetting the other names. At any rate, Lovecraft's papers are the most looked at of any in that library. One of my sponsors was the John Nicholas Brown Center, which gave me an office in that lovely house you see there. The Brown family, very prominent family in the early history of Providence, founders of Brown University, got their money from slave trading. And they play a role in Lovecraft's novel, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which is a novel set in Providence. And partly it's about the dark history of Providence, I think you can say. Through the 20s and 30s, Lovecraft traveled extensively to antiquarian sites, from Quebec City in the north to Key West in the south to New Orleans in the west, documenting his trip in illustrated letters and later in extensive travelogues that circulated among his friends and were posthumously published. You see some at the tops of the slide there, some of the illustrations from one of his letters. He had very little money. He would take buses. He would arrive in some city, stay in the cheapest place he could, probably some hostel, eat barely anything. He'd buy a can of beans and just eat the beans straight out of the can. And then he would go on extensive walking tours around the city during the day. And then at night, he'd come back to his room at the hostel, wherever he was staying, and stay up much of the night, writing up what he'd seen during the day. Then he'd send those out in letters to people, particularly he'd send them in letters to his aunts back in Providence, because then when he went back to Providence, those letters would be there and he could use them to write his travelogues. Lovecraft's travel writings dwarf his fiction in sheer volume. He wrote what amounted to monographs on such places as Brooklyn, Richmond, Philadelphia, various parts of New England. His travelogues for Charleston, South Carolina, and for Quebec City are his two longest pieces of writing. The one for Quebec City is his longest. And below, in the bottom there, you see the burying ground at Marblehead taken during Lovecraft's lifetime. He loved Marblehead, Massachusetts. He went back repeatedly. And now, if you look at online at some of the tourist material Marblehead has posted, they actually quote Lovecraft and some of that. In Lovecraft's day, tourism was a booming industry in the US. Tourism by car and by bus. As I mentioned, Lovecraft traveled by bus. His city tours resembled the published tours that he read. He would read the published tours before he went to the city or while he was at the city. They generally start with histories of the place, then have these different walking tours for different parts of the city, containing a great deal of information. On the side there, you see Samuel Adams Drake, Books and Corners of the New England Coast. Drake was a very popular writer at that time. I don't think anyone knows him anymore, but he published a lot of books, was very popular at that time, including travel books, but also other kinds of books. He published several books on New England folklore, for example. Lovecraft was a big fan of his, heard him speak several times, and he definitely was influenced by him and the way he wrote his own travel logs. Other things we had, the Touring New England is about car tours of New England. When I read it, it reminded me of Lovecraft's travel logs, for one thing, because the author of that book, Clara Walker White, would write about visiting historic places in New England and being absolutely horrified that they were inhabited by immigrants who weren't speaking English, which is sort of a Lovecraft attitude too. And then the book on Charleston, and Lovecraft was in New Orleans, and he did busters of New Orleans. So I don't know whether he went on the yellow line or the gray line, but that's a brochure from his day. But Lovecraft was passionate about this stuff. I cannot tell it, but have to sing it. He wrote about Marblehead. I had sojourned for a time in the past itself, not the past of books, but the living, breathing streets. Since then, I have dreamt of nothing but Marblehead. Although his travelogues were modeled after published travel guides, they were scholarly in nature, with very detailed information about the built environment, often illustrated with Lovecraft's drawings. It's interesting to go to some of these places now with his travel guides and sort of see how things have changed from when he visited. They also include a good deal of folklore, gathered from observation or from people he talked to, legends, supernatural beliefs, street vendor cries, people selling crafts on the street, things like that. Just for example, when he was in Salem, Massachusetts, he went up to this house, and he wanted to see more of it, so he knocked on the door. Lovecraft was kind of bashful, but he seemed not to have been bashful when it came to visiting interesting buildings he wanted to see. So he knocked on the door, and these two elderly women came, and they let him in, and they showed him around the house. They even gave him a cup of tea, and they started to talk to him about supernatural legends that they knew. So then he recorded those later in his letters home. One of them was about the window that retains the image of the dead person, which actually is a fairly common supernatural motif. But he used that later on in one of the Funja from Yaggoth sonnets. So he also noted all the cats that he met. Lovecraft loved cats. He had a number of cats himself during his life. And when he'd be walking around these towns and he'd meet a cat, and he'd pick it up if the cat was willing to be picked up and pet it. And he would describe it sometimes with some detail in his walking tour descriptions. So there you see Lovecraft with a cat, but also another page from one of his letters from one of these walking tours, and a close-up of a drawing that's in one of his letters. Historic preservation. At home in Providence, Lovecraft was a frequent advocate for preserving historic buildings. He also would mourn the destruction of buildings in other places he went, like I already mentioned, the north side of Boston. But he became an activist in Providence, and there are a number of examples of this, but one of the main ones is Brick Row. Brick Row was a row of 1816 brick warehouses fronting on the Providence River at the base of College Hill. Lovecraft loved these because to him they were a romantic reminder of Providence's former importance as a center of maritime commerce. So he made his own plan for getting them restored and reused. He organized an intensive letter writing campaign. Wrote letters himself, but also tried to get his friends to write letters. And he even wrote the letters for his friends to put their names on and send to the paper or send to whoever. Unfortunately, they were demolished anyway in 1929. The city of Providence had a plan to develop that area after they knocked down their warehouses. But then the Depression hit. So for the rest of Lovecraft's life, they were just empty lots. He was pretty upset about it. All of this transmutes into Lovecraft's fiction. And it's interesting how the things Lovecraft was most passionate about and which gave him the most pleasure in life often become the source of horror in his fiction. The Shadow over Innsmouth is a good example. The narrator of the story, an antiquarian very much like Lovecraft. He's coming from the Midwest, but he has ancestral roots in New England, so he's traveling around different towns. He's interested in architecture. He's doing walking tours. He's going to local libraries and historical centers to do research. The town of Innsmouth is not even on his map, but he finds out about it and thinks, wow, this depressed, obscure town probably has some great old architecture, right? So he takes a bus there, embarks on a quote, systematic, though half bewildered, architectural walking tour. He interviews some people, and the story has some long narratives from the people he interviewed written in dialect. Um, the pretty detailed physical description of the town is based on Lovecraft explorations of Newburyport and other towns on the North Shore of Massachusetts Bay, which were economically depressed at the time. Apparently, Newburyport now is a upscale tourist mecca, so it's rather different than from in Lovecraft's day. But eventually, he discovers that the town is populated by semi-human offspring of miscegenation between New Englanders and monsters from the sea, which causes him to flee, pursued by the townspeople. One of the most interesting things about that story, however, is that after the narrator escapes from the town, he then does more genealogical research and he finds that some of his ancestors came from Innsmouth. And then he starts to transform himself. He starts to have dreams, which apparently are being sent to him by his great-great-great-grandmother or something like that, who is living in the water off of Innsmouth. There's a city of the deep ones under the water off of Innsmouth, which is this beautiful city. It's described as this beautiful city by Lovecraft. And eventually, at the end of the story, he's going back to Innsmouth to go down and join his ancestors down there. So the interesting thing is that people who have written about the shadow over Innsmouth sometimes see that transformation as part of the horror. The narrator has turned into a monster, but you can also see it as the narrator embracing what had been to him the alien. So it sort of depends on how you look at that. But certainly there's this fascination with the alien and with themes like miscegenation with Lovecraft. And over time, it becomes more ambiguous. Anyway, here's an excerpt. The first excerpt, the narrator, who's never named, by the way, it's told in the first person, is coming on the bus down a hill towards the town. It was a town of wide extent and dense construction, yet one with a pretentious dearth of visible life. From the tangle of chimney pots, scarcely a wisp of smoke came, and the three tall steeples loomed stark and unpainted against the seaward horizon. The vast huddle of sagging gambrel roofs and peaked gables conveyed with offensive clearness the idea of wormy decay. There were some large square Georgian houses, too, with hipped roofs, cupolas, and railed widows' walks. Stretching inland from among them, I saw the rusted, grass-grown line of the abandoned railway, along which he later escapes. Thus I began my systematic, though half-bewildered tour of Innsmouth's narrow, shadow-blighted ways. Those two photos are historic photos from about Lovecraft's day of Newburyport, which I guess was Innsmouth sort of transmuted by Lovecraft. Actually, an earlier story here was sort of a similar plot. Also a person from the Midwest who has ancestral roots in New England and who is coming home at the Yuletide to the town that his ancestors came from, which is Kingsport, another Massachusetts coastal town. He's coming over the rise, looking down on the town. I was far from home, and the spell of the eastern sea was upon me. In the twilight, I heard it pounding on the rocks, and I knew it lay just over the hill where the twisting willows writhed against the clearing sky and the first stars of evening. And because my fathers had called me to the old town beyond, I pushed on through the shallow, new-fallen snow along the road that soared lonely up to where Aldebaran twinkled among the trees, on toward the very ancient town I had never seen but often dreamed of. Of course, this being Lovecraft, he encounters, shall we say, unexpected things there. And then another one of his better known stories, The Dunwich Horror. This one is about car tourism, or at least it opens with that. The first sentence of the story, when a traveler in north central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of the Aylesbury Pike just beyond Dean's Corners, these are real places, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. So north central Massachusetts, Lovecraft himself had toured it in a car. He didn't own the car, some friends did, but they had toured that area where the story's set. But you take the wrong turn, right? You get off the tourist route and you see the authentic stuff, right? The stuff tourists don't see. In other words, you see Dunwich. Across a covered bridge, one sees a small village huddled between the stream and the vertical slope of Round Mountain and wonders at the cluster of rotting gambrel roofs. Both Innsmouth and Dunwich have rotting gambrel roofs, bespeaking an earlier architectural period than that of the neighboring region. Afterward, one sometimes learns that one has been through Dunwich. I won't describe the plot, but it has to do with miscegenation. Well, I mentioned that before. It has to do with miscegenation between humans and aliens. And again, folklore. One of many examples of Lovecraft collecting, and making use in his stories of folklore. On a 1928 antiquarian trip to Wilbraham, Massachusetts, which is in western Massachusetts near Springfield, Lovecraft encountered the belief that, in his own words, whippoorwills, and there's a slide of one, are psychopomps lying in wait for the souls of the dying, and that they time their eerie cries in unison with the sufferer's struggling breath. In the Dunwich Horror, the whippoorwills are said to try to capture the soul as it leaves the body. If they fail, their cries cease and they soon disperse. But if they succeed, their shrill voices burst into a kind of pandemoniac cachinnation. I had to pause to pronounce that word, which lasts for hours. So he takes the belief he hears, but then he, does what Lovecraft does with things like that. World building. This is a term folks who write about science fiction and fantasy use. World building is the way you make your story set on a made-up world believable by giving it a realistic, made up but realistic background. And maybe one of the ultimate examples everybody knows of that is J.R.R. Tolkien, who spent so much time creating Middle Earth with all this unpublished material that then becomes the setting for his novels. Anyway, Lovecraft also did world building in a really different way from Tolkien. Lovecraft was critical of writers who used folklore without reworking it. Those who wrote, for example, literary versions of old fairy tales without really changing the fairy tale. He advocated using what he called folk myths to create new artificial myths. The most interesting thing about Lovecraft's use of folklore was not so much his incorporation of actual items or text into his stories, not so much the whippoorwills here and the window with the dead person's image in it here, but his invention of tradition, his use of the structures, the styles, the devices of folklore in a way that make his fiction seem like folklore. Folklore is actually have a word for that. They call it the folkloresque, which is an authorial invention which seems like folklore, has the smell of folklore, but is an authorial invention. And it could be a literary thing. It could also be a film or a comic or a video game or a work of visual art or anything that does that. This was Lovecraft's world building, bringing together references to folklore, to history, to the built environment, to current events, many other things, and mixing these with his own scientific things too, like astronomy, these real things, and mixing these with his own creations. Invented New England towns, books of occult lore such as the Necronomicon, alien gods and monsters such as Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and Nyarlathotep and Shub-Niggurath and many others that he came up with in such a way that readers don't know where the borrowing stops and the invention starts. And that is the whole point. So he started a mythos, as people tend to call what he created. Lovecraft was a friend or a mentor to many other writers who were part of the Lovecraft circle and who published in similar places, including people like Clark Ashton Smith, the California poet and fantasy writer, Robert E. Howard, Texas writer, probably best known for creating the character Conan the Barbarian. Younger writers like Robert Bloch, I think Bloch wrote Lovecraft a fan letter when he was maybe like 12 or something like that. And they were correspondence thereafter. Bloch's probably best known for writing Psycho, which Hitchcock made into a famous movie. But Lovecraft became a mentor to Bloch and to many other writers. These guys would send Lovecraft their stories. Lovecraft would comment on, they'd give them advice. He really spent a lot of time mentoring a lot of these guys. August Derleth was another regional Wisconsin writer. Um, but one thing these writers did was they shared a body of invented lore and mythos, places, occult tomes, monsters, cultists, and so on. They each made up their own stuff, and they each borrowed stuff from each other. Mentioned their friends and colleagues' inventions in their own stories. Also, Lovecraft's ghostwritten stuff. He'd get a crummy story from some writer who wanted to sell the Weird Tales magazine, so he would totally rewrite it. It would get published under that person's name, but he would put in his own mythos stuff in it. So he'd work the Necronomicon or whatever, Yog Sothoth into it somewhere. So readers who were reading things like Weird Tales would find all these stories by different writers that all referred to this stuff, right? Which makes it seem even more believable. Lovecraft would get letters from readers wanting to know how to find a copy of the Necronomicon or asking about the realities of his settings or his monsters. And he'd write back and say, well, I'm sorry, but I made that up. Then I just have some examples. The Necronomicon, Cthulhu, his extraterrestrial god, I guess you could sort of call it, at least he has cult followers, who lives in this island, Leah, under the Pacific, and wants to rise back up and wipe out the human race. And a map of his city of Arkham, including Miskatonic University in Arkham. Fiction as hoax, another letter. The more I consider weird fiction, the more am I convinced that a solidly realistic framework is needed in order to build up a preparation for the unreal element. My own rule is that no weird story can truly produce terror unless it is devised with all the care and verisimilitude of an actual hoax. The author must forget all about short story technique and build up a stark, simple account full of homely corroborative details, just as if he were trying to put across a deception in real life, a deception clever enough to make adults believe it. My own attitude in writing is always that of a hoax weaver. For the time being, I try to forget formal literature and simply devise a lie as carefully as a crooked witness prepares a line of testimony with cross-examining lawyers in his mind. Now, I probably should say that stark, simple account Lovecraft probably wasn't that stark and simple a lot of the time, but anyway. But on the other hand, I mean, so many people have become so convinced by his creations, even down to the present. I mean, he seemed like he really succeeded in thinking about fiction that way as hoax. Also, as a folklorist, that makes you think about legends, like urban legends. You think of a famous urban legend like the Vanishing Hitchhiker or something like that. You know that legend? When somebody tells it, although it's known all over the world and versions have been recorded since way back in the 19th century sometime, when somebody's still around and when somebody tells it, they'll set it locally. Oh, this happened to my girlfriend's cousin, north of fill in town that they live in a couple of years ago. And that makes it seem believable, right? The homely corroborative details. So what Lovecraft is doing is a little bit like what happens with something like a legend in oral circulation. I did want to say a word about Lovecraft's writing style. Not everybody likes Lovecraft's writing style. Lovecraft liked exotic words like eldritch, squamous, blasphemous, fungoid, gibber, tenebrious. It's kind of fun to say those. And others, words that are exotic, but which also are hybrid. They take us beyond our usual categories. So to talk about a person as being fungoid, right? Is it a person? Is it a fungus? What is it? Sometimes the words are racially coded. Swarthy, which basically means dark skinned, but he uses that in a very threatening kind of way. Mongrel, which was a term used for basically people of mixed race. Others are less clearly racial, but are when you consider the context in which you use them. Something like squamous, which means scaly, but used to describe a human, or ichthys, which means fish-like, or relating to fish. Those do become racial the way Lovecraft used them in his stories. I should also add, though, if you go back and look at stories in the pulp magazines of the era, certainly in Weird Tales, but some of those words get used by, like mongrel, that gets used all the time by the writers back then. Um, a lot of the writers in those magazines were racist. You know, one thing you get a lot in the 20s and 30s, which Lovecraft didn't do, was this sort of yellow peril, quote unquote, stuff about the evil Chinese who were going to take over the West. That was a big theme in popular literature back then. But most of those writers we don't read anymore with good reason. Most of them weren't very good. Lovecraft we still read. So to us, when Lovecraft uses that kind of thing, maybe it seems more shocking. I don't mean to excuse him, but the racism was there in a good deal of that pulp literature of the era. Lovecraft's early stories often exhibited purple prose, but his later stories tended to begin with a calmer or more descriptive tone, which gradually becomes more exotic as the story becomes more fantastic. One good example of that is The Call of Cthulhu, but my example is The Color Out of Space, which if I had to choose one Lovecraft story that's my favorite, would probably be my choice. The beginning of the story: west of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. On the gentler slopes, there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss-coated cottages brooding eternally over old New England secrets in the lee of great ledges. But these are all vacant now, the wide chimneys crumbling and the shingled sides bulging perilously beneath those low gambrel roofs. There's those decaying gambrel roofs again. But he's making the setting there, right? But the plot is about this meteorite, which lands on a remote farm, and then something comes down with it, which infects the area. Lovecraft's description of what happens there has been compared to nuclear fallout, although the story was published in 1927. But at any rate, eventually, whatever it is goes down into the well, and from there tries to go back up into space, whatever arrived with that meteorite. And there are some humans there watching this, and this is from the climax of the story. What it is, only God knows. In terms of matter, I suppose the thing Amy described would be called a gas, but this gas obeyed laws that are not of our cosmos. This was no fruit of such worlds and suns as shine on the telescopes and photographic plates of our observatories. This was no breath from the skies whose motions and dimensions our astronomers measure are deemed too vast to measure. It was just a color out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity beyond all nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extra-cosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. It's a good example of his cosmicism, but also the way he moves into a sort of more frenzied or emotional kind of language in the course of the story. He does that quite deliberately as a way of building up a certain emotional state gradually and then culminating with that paragraph. It's not the last paragraph, but it's the climax. So to sum up a couple of these points, tradition gives meaning to life. Another letter. In a cosmos without absolute values, there is only one anchor of fixity, and that anchor is tradition. The potent emotional legacy bequeathed to us by the massed experience of our ancestors, individual or national, biological or cultural. Tradition means nothing cosmically, but it means everything locally and pragmatically because we have nothing else to shield us from a devastating sense of lostness in endless time and space. It's the last defense against the dark, to quote the title of my presentation. And then you have the humans being tiny in the universe slide. On top and below are old houses in Providence, tradition. It's Benefit Street in Providence. But we can also invent traditions. We can make our own traditions. Folklorists call this traditionalizing. We do this through a process of bricolage, which is a term from Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, but recombining and building on older traditions. We don't make new traditions totally new from scratch. We have no way of doing that. We build on and we combine older traditions, and that is how we traditionalize. This process creates an opening for others to build on Lovecraft, giving rise to his continuing popularity, his influence on other creative artists, and his fan culture. A few examples there. On top, Guillermo del Toro, the film director, very influenced by Lovecraft. He's been trying to make a movie about the Mountains of Madness, hasn't so far succeeded in getting the studio to greenlight that, but under that, we have Junji Ito, great manga artist, who is also very influenced by Lovecraft. A lot of his stuff is very much cosmic horror. Down at the bottom is the great Argentinian writer Mariana Enriquez, who, among other things, wrote the novel Our Share of Night, which is an absolute masterpiece, in my opinion. And also very influenced by Lovecraft. That's quite obvious in some of her stories. And then Joyce Carol Oates, I don't have a picture of her. Instead, what I chose to put was the cover of her collection of Lovecraft stories that she edited and wrote the introduction to. But she also has acknowledged Lovecraft as an influence on her work, at least on the darker part, the more horror story part of her work. All of her work's kind of dark. Maybe I should say the things that are more explicitly horror stories. His influence, some ways he's been influential, bringing modern concerns, threats posed by progress, the meaninglessness of human life on a cosmic scale into horror stories, creating his own mythology. It's been called an anti-mythology, an alternate history of the earth. That's influenced many writers and filmmakers, either directly or at least indirectly, but that's the idea of doing that. And elements of this have gained a life of their own, right? You see the Necronomicon and Cthulhu all over the place. Also, he's been influential as a philosopher and historian of the literary horror story. He saw horror stories as an art form that should be taken seriously and thought deeply about their aesthetics. And this comes through in his essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, which still gets cited all the time. Some ways that Lovecraft is still with us. The genre of cosmic horror, influential in both the horror story and science fiction. Lovecraft in popular culture, the Lovecraft fan culture. Tourism, especially in Providence. Borrowings from Lovecraft in various occult and magical movements. So Lovecraft's work, or the influence of his work, I think it was Victoria Nelson who called it backdoor spirituality, right? Lovecraft was an atheist, but somehow the spirituality gets in through the back door on a writer like him. Lovecraft's influence on philosophy and his racism. Can we keep reading Lovecraft because he was a racist? Or is there a way to read him while addressing his racism? Cosmic horror. The gentleman there is Ramsey Campbell, a great contemporary British horror writer, very influenced by Lovecraft. Other examples, Lovecraft Unbound. That's just one example of many, many books that have been published with collections of Lovecraftian stories. The two novels after that, Syndalis and Fisherman, are just both examples of Lovecraftian novels by a couple of skilled contemporary horror writers. Then down below, Alien, I think is in many ways a very Lovecraftian movie. John Carpenter's The Thing. John Carpenter, very influenced by Lovecraft. In our conversations with him, he has often said that. And other movies besides The Thing, like In the Mouth of Madness, that's a very Lovecraftian movie. Even the title sounds like Lovecraft. The Endless, if you've ever seen that, is a really good independent, sort of low budget horror film, but very well done and very Lovecraftian. And then another, that's probably, at least of the ones I've read, Junji Ito's most Lovecraftian book, Censored. John Carpenter, by the way, is a native of Bowling Green, Kentucky, where Eileen and I live. Popular culture. Lovecraft has become fairly ubiquitous in popular culture. References to him or to his creations, Cthulhu, the Necronomicon, Arkham, Miskatonic University, etc., turn up all over the place. From the Evil Dead films to Batman to The Simpsons to South Park. to heavy metal music, to comics. If you want to dress as Cthulhu for Halloween, it's easy to find a Cthulhu mask online. And plush Cthulhus seem to be a big thing. Why you would want a cute plus version of a monster that wants to wipe out the human race, I guess that's an interesting issue to discuss. Then we have South Park at the bottom there, where Cthulhu has been brought back by the oil companies drilling in the ocean. Lovecraft fan culture. Lovecraft has a very active fan culture. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game has been the most popular horror RPG role-playing game. There are Lovecraftian board games and card games. One of the board games is Arkham Horror that you see there. There's a biannual Lovecraft conference or convention, the Necronomicon, held in Providence on even-numbered years. There are at least two that I know of, Lovecraft film festivals in Providence and in Portland, Oregon. You can see from my lower image there that the one in Portland has been going for quite a long time now. There is a great deal of Lovecraftian fanfic, fan fiction, fan art, fan films, and so on, much of which you can find on the internet. A lot of miscellaneous, such as t-shirts, bumper stickers, even tattoos. I own, I think, 4 different Miskatonic University t-shirts, and I'm sure there's many others out there. And I also had a Miskatonic University license plate holder in the back of my car. Dell may remember that. Tourism in Providence. Lovecraft is a big thing in Providence tourism now. So we have downtown, the Lovecraft Memorial Square. See the sign. We have the statue of Lovecraft downtown, holding a book in one hand, maybe it's a Necronomicon, I don't know, with a tentacle coming out, holding a telescope in the other hand, his love of astronomy, and then with the cats. So things that Lovecraft loved, books, telescopes, and cats. There are at least 2 memorials to Lovecraft in Providence. The one on the left is more downtown. No, the one on the left is where he was born, where his grandfather's house used to be. And then the one to the right of that is on campus, Brown University. And then below, on the right, is the Lovecraft Arts and Sciences store, which has been there for like 20 years or something now. It's apparently quite successful in downtown. You can take tours. I know that Providence Historic Preservation Society offers Lovecraft tours. I think there's some other organizations that do. And see places associated with him, either with his life or his stories. So the house second from the right is Lovecraft's own house that he lived in the last part of his life with his aunt. It's a pretty typical kind of early 19th century house type for the Providence area, but he was very proud of it. In fact, he had a book plate made of the doorway. The next house over is the Halsey Mansion, a sort of Georgian Adams-esque house. You can see how long ago I took this picture, because there is Eileen with our son Ethan, who is now 29. But this house was thought in Lovecraft's own day to be haunted. And he used it in his fiction. His novel, The Case of Charles Dixon Ward, it is the house where Charles Dixon Ward grew up. And then his grave on the left. Swan Point Cemetery in Providence is a beautiful 19th century garden cemetery. It's worth visiting if you're ever in Providence, just for its own sake. But the most visited grave there easily is Lovecraft's. And if you visit that, people always leave stuff, not just things you would expect, like flowers and shells and rocks, but frequently they leave drawings and poems and stories and things like that on the grave. Oh, and then the quote on the bottom, he wrote this in a letter after he returned to Providence from New York City. I am Providence, and Providence is myself. Together, indissolubly as one, we stand through the ages. And that's what's on his gravestone. I am Providence. Occult and magical movements. Although Lovecraft was an atheist and was skeptical of occultism, to put it mildly, his work has been described as backdoor spirituality. Lovecraftian elements have appeared in a number of occult and magical movements. For example, Anton LaVey included Lovecraftian rituals in the Satanic Bible. British occultist and Thelemite leader Kenneth Grant drew on Lovecraft, as did Phil Hine and other practitioners of chaos magic. Several books claiming to be the Necronomicon have been published. The one you see the most is the one by Simon, which is the one in the middle there. But there are several other books published. Usually the Necronomicons that are published are basically collections of spells like grimoires, which isn't the way Lovecraft described the Necronomicon, but Lovecraft and philosophy. Lovecraft has been an influence and inspiration in the speculative realist movement associated with Graham Harman and some other philosophers. They take from Lovecraft, and the books there, one is a collection of his philosophical writings, and then Graham Harman's book. These guys, the speculative realists, take from Lovecraft the idea that the universe is ultimately unknowable. We can never grasp something in its entirety. The qualities of a thing always recede from our comprehension. Lovecraft's writing, likewise, is predicated around things beyond our ability to apprehend, let alone comprehend. We can't really even perceive them, much less understand them. From unnameable colors that corrupt their surroundings, as in the color out of space, to a Cthulhu idol that both resembles and does not resemble a blend of octopus, man, and dragon. As far as Lovecraft's racism goes, an interesting recent development is anti-racist and feminist Lovecraftian fiction, which has been a significant movement recently. The Ballad of Black Tom Bear by Victor Laval is based on his story, The Horror at Red Hook, that I had that quote from earlier, basically playing up in his race. In a way, it plays a tribute to Lovecraft, but also makes the racism of that story a theme of the novel. Lovecraft Country, which definitely dwells on Lovecraft racism and was turned into a TV series. The Dream Quest of Bellet Bow is a rewrite of well, really a sequel to Lovecraft's novel, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, with a woman as a central character. She Walks in Shadows, a collection of Lovecraftian stories by women writers. Many of them have some kind of feminist takes on Lovecraft. Another example, Winter Tide, which is a sequel to The Shadow over Innsmouth, but it has a multicultural cast. Other topics, issues, the role of dreams. Lovecraft had vivid dreams throughout much of his life. The base stories are elements of those come into many of his stories. Dreams in general are important in many of his stories, like Cthulhu communicates with his followers by sending dreams to them. Women in his stories we could talk about. Really, there are very few, or at least who are significant characters. He's been criticized for that. I think the problem is not that Lovecraft was a misogynist. I don't think he was, but that he just wasn't skilled enough to create very believable or in-depth characters that were different from himself, basically, is what it came down to. His politics, which basically went from very conservative, the way he was brought up. By the end of his life, he'd become a fairly ardent socialist. But there's some ambiguity there, whether it was, he also was a strong advocate for Franklin Delano. He loved Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But there's some ambiguity in his socialism, whether it was more democratic socialism or it was more of a fascist version of socialism. And that kind of depends on which letters you read and how you interpret that. Lovecraft and science, he kept up with science, especially astronomy, and enters into his stories in many ways. The Lovecraft Circle, this huge circle of correspondence he had. His international reputation, he's been translated into many, many languages. He's read around the world. And this big Lovecraft following in, for example, Japan, just to name one place. And then what do we make of Lovecraft in 2025? This is my last slide. So just end with this letter that he wrote to Farnsworth Wright, who was the editor of Weird Tales magazine. Now, all my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. To achieve the essence of real externality, whether of time or space or dimension, one must forget that such things as organic life, good and evil, love and hate, and all such local attributes of a negligible and temporary race called mankind have any existence at all. These must be handled with unsparing realism. But when we cross the line to the boundless and hideous unknown, the shadow-haunted outside, we must remember to leave our humanity and terrestrialism at the threshold. Thank you.
The question, why are we still discussing Lovecraft today, I think, is the most poignant. Because in a very real way, Lovecraft tried to wrestle with what it means to be a human being, what it means to be terrestrially on this planet, with all of the complexity and anxiety that comes with that. And I think that the great thing about Lovecraft is his honesty and about a lot of those situations. And particularly when we're thinking about spiritual solutions or the way that we are looking in these sorts of things, the way that we are engaging with these principles and ideas, obviously he had a very different perspective than the one that we are advocating. But you can learn tremendous things from seriously engaging him, which is also, I would say, the great point about his essay on the importance of the Gothic in literature or the horror literature, because it is inviting you to examine an element of existence that is often the most difficult, but most powerful. And Lovecraft has this phrase where he talks about fear being the oldest emotion. Mariano Villalba, who's an Argentine scholar, he's going to be speaking to us in February. He tells a story about when he was a boy, people used to call the National Library of Argentina and ask for the Necronomicon. And Borges, when he was director of the National Library, made a card for it and swore that it was there, but not to everyone's eyes.
Lovecraft wrote a mock essay in the history of the Necronomicon, which I think it was that essay which listed places in the world that had copies, and that Argentina was one. I think it was how that connection came to be.
And Jorge Luis Borges, who himself was someone who very much loved to play with it. By the way, it's very interesting his interpretation of Swedenborg for these same things. But Jorge Luis Borges embraced that completely, and in many ways, his fiction, he writes fictional footnotes and invites you to follow trails that don't exist. And I think in many ways he builds that directly from Lovecraft, who did a similar way remarkably well.
He also dedicated one of his stories to Lovecraft.
Ah, the great, yeah. But again, I mean, as you were talking, by the way, the thing that stood out to me is the same thing that stood out when we were originally reading your essay, which is he really gets the love of history in a way that I think no other writer ever has, in the sense that, you know, and I know many of us, Robert's probably one of these, there's probably many of us who are living here who feel more alive in the past than you do in the present. I always make the joke, I exist in the present, I live in the past, which Wouter Hanegraaff swears he's going to quote me one day on. And he really gets that when he talks about this great, amazing love that you have for all of these tiny, picky details about what life was like. And I can just relate to that so well.